everyone, welcome back to Talking Politics. We have a really exciting episode for you today, and I've been looking forward to it for a long time. And we're going to be discussing CANZUK. So I'm sort of on the fence when it comes to CANZUK. I'm speaking from a position of ignorance here. So to help me out and to sort of push me off, we have James Skinner, who is possibly the best man in the world to do that for us. And he's the founder and the chief executive of the CANZUK movement, or CANZUK International. And it's really wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much.
I appreciate you having me on. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. So what exactly is CANZUK, and why should Canadians want it?
Yeah, so it's a convoluted topic, but simply put, CANZUK is an acronym for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And what we at CANZUK International do is we essentially aim to advance the diplomatic ties between these four countries. Like I say, it's very convoluted, really, but there's three main aspects that we're essentially trying to aim for. The first one is probably the most popular aspect of the movement, and that is facilitated migration, which is essentially that citizens between these four countries could live, work, and travel freely without visas or work permits like we currently have at the moment. The second side of it would be free trade. Where obviously these four countries can trade freely with each other, which of course implies the removal of barriers to commerce and lower consumer products, more availability of consumer products. And then the third and final one would be foreign policy cooperation, which essentially means these four countries would work together for security, for intelligence, basically building on the relationships that they already have founded with the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. So that implies extra national security and also just a safer sort of society, within these four countries and for the world in general. So really, it's those three main aspects that we're aiming for, being the migration, trade, and foreign policy cooperation between these four countries.
Right. And every time I see a poll on CANZUK, I'm almost astonished by how popular it is. It's in the 60s and 70% in New Zealand, yeah, Australia, Canada, and Britain. Why is that?
We're just as astonished ourselves. When we actually commissioned the first polling, we didn't expect it to be that high. We even had quite a considerable amount of support in Quebec, which we thought would be quite low, but that turned out to be close to the 60th percentile too. For me, and of course I'm biased in this, but for me, I think the high percentage support in these countries is that we share so much in common through our ancestry and also just through our close bonds that we have on the international sphere too. Just to name a few of the similarities that we have, we share the same majority language being English. We share the same common law legal system, the same Westminster style parliamentary system, same respect for human rights and the rule of law and democracy. We have very good economic growth rates, very good GDP per capita rates, very low unemployment, very good healthcare systems. The list goes on and on and on as to why we're so compatible for implementing facilitated migration or free movement, whatever you want to call it. And also as well, trade and foreign policy, these countries, we work together so well in the international sphere, whether it's the United Nations, or whether it's, with maybe NATO or the Five Eyes Intelligence Network, as I've already mentioned. So I think for us to develop this further is a natural progression of that relationship. And I think it's obviously, as polling has shown, it's something that's widely supported across the four countries too.
Yeah, I was interested to see that it was so popular in Quebec. And 60% is, of course, it's obviously less compared to Ontario. But yeah, these people the Quebecois, they don't share the same heritage as, say, English Canadians do. They don't share the same language, as you mentioned. And yet, it's really popular. And I'm struggling to understand why.
Yeah, it's we were shocked it was going to be that high. We thought it would be in the 40th or the 50th percentile, but it was actually in the, from memory, I think it was like close to the 60th percentile. But yeah, I think, again, like you say, you're exactly right. The majority language is, of course, French, and they don't really share the same cultural or historical ancestry, I guess you could say, as the British or Australians or New Zealanders. But at the same time, it's also that CANZUK for the Quebecois offers, multitude of opportunities. For example, if you are a citizen of Quebec, a Canadian citizen living in Quebec, you have the opportunity to go and live and work and study in Australia, New Zealand, or the UK if you so choose to. If you want to set up a business in Australia or New Zealand, you can go and do that. If you want to go and study in the UK at one of the top universities in the United Kingdom, you have that opportunity to go and do that, whereas you wouldn't have that opportunity if you were, say, independent or from another country. So I think, you're absolutely right. There are differences there, but of course the opportunities remain the same, as other Canadians, simply that, it's a wide variety of opportunities for them to undertake. And, I think that's the reason why majority of them support it.
Yes, but I think, yes, it is enormously important and popular for the Quebecois to say, yeah, you can live in New Zealand, Australia, or Britain. But I wonder how the CAQ would react if you said, well, equally so, 130 million English speakers also have access to Quebec. And I suspect one of the reasons why CANZUK is so popular is because it still is quite a nebulous idea. And when you look at the policies as a whole, is when you start to see potential conflicts. The EU was pretty popular once as well, and then when we actually applied it, we found it wasn't great. So I wonder, does that make it less realistic? Say, for that instance with the Quebecois, or take New Zealand, who recently, put sort of a housing ban for foreign citizens. If you said, well, I suppose Australians currently can, but if you said, well, the British, which is a country of 66 million people, and Canadians, a country of 36 million people, could have access to buy your property, then surely there'd be some reservation about it.
Yeah, it was actually the same arguments that were brought up in 1973, I think, when Australia and New Zealand signed on to what was called the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement. And that's the agreement that effectively is the foundation of CANZUK, whereby Australian and New Zealand citizens can live and work freely in each other's countries, providing, of course, you don't have a criminal record, you don't have terrorist affiliations, you don't have an infectious health condition, and other issues like that. So, a New Zealander can freely live and work in Australia without any visas or work permits, and vice versa. An Australian can live and work in New Zealand as well. And the same arguments were brought in the 1970s when they implemented that, saying, well, you've got Australia, which is a population of about 23 million people, and you've got tiny New Zealand, which is a population of about 4 million people. They were saying, well, New Zealand is going to be inundated with Australians. They're all going to come to New Zealand. They're going to take our jobs. There's going to be, it's going to be hell to play basically for it. But the reality is that it never actually happened. Not like what we've seen in the European Union, for example, where, the UK, Germany, and France have seen an influx of people coming from Eastern Europe, but they haven't seen the same return going the other way. So I think the reason for that, obviously, as well, is that there wouldn't be the same sort of conflict if CANZUK was implemented. Quite simply because, like I say, these countries are very similar, and there's no real, I guess you could say, increased benefit from moving to those countries rather than your own personal. So whereas, in the European Union, for example, there's an increased benefit from moving to a more prosperous country, simply because it's more prosperous. You have better healthcare, better wages, better working conditions, and the list goes on. Whereas if you're moving from Australia to New Zealand, the healthcare systems are very similar. The working conditions are very similar. The human rights are very similar. The pay is, a little bit different, but it's nowhere near compared to, say, if you were, a citizen of India moving to the United Kingdom. It would be minimal in comparison to that. So I think the same thing would happen as well with CANZUK. Like, say with, the UK and Canada, obviously Canada is a population of about 36 million people and the UK is about 64 million. So you could almost effectively say that the UK is double the population of Canada, but likewise what you've seen with Australia and New Zealand, you wouldn't see the influx of migration coming from that, or a horde of Englishmen coming across the Atlantic Ocean to come and take Canadian jobs, simply because the qualities of life in these countries are so similar anyway. Nobody from the UK would move to Canada for better healthcare, and nobody from Canada would move to the UK for better pay. It just simply doesn't happen that way because these countries are so well developed, so economically similar, and also have similar ties in that comparison too. So, it's a good point to bring up for sure. But, the same arguments were posed in the 70s with Australia and New Zealand, and it never really happened. And, if history tells us anything, it wouldn't happen with CANZUK either.
That's a good point, actually. I also have had the opportunity to sort of scroll through your website over recent days, and I noticed that on your advisory board, it sort of filled to the brim with conservative politicians from across the Anglosphere.
Yeah.
I noticed how there was a slight omission of left-wing politicians. Why is CANZUK being supported by conservatives and yet totally avoided by, liberals or the Labour parties in Australia or New Zealand?
Yeah, it's a fair observation as well. So we haven't designed it that way. We are strictly a non-partisan organization, and we'll give a platform to anybody in any of the 4 countries who supports our proposals, regardless of party affiliation. Why it is mostly supported by the Conservatives versus, say, the Liberals or the NDP, speaking from a Canadian perspective, is anybody's guess, really. My own personal take on it is I think the Conservatives, very more affiliated with, say, the Commonwealth, very more affiliated with ancestral ties. And of course, CANZUK strikes a chord with them because they think, well, these are the countries who we have great relations with on the international sphere. And these are the countries who we have historical ties with, that have lasted for generations. Whereas I would say perhaps the Liberals and NDP would probably feel more affiliated with reaching out across oceans to form new relationships. So, for example, with China, or whether with the Middle East or maybe African countries. And that's not to say either, line of thought is right or wrong. Everybody has their own reasons. Everybody has their own experiences for thinking these ways. But that's just my speculation on the reason. But you are absolutely right. Obviously, we are by non-design appealing more to Conservatives. But at the same time, we do also have a lot of support as well from, I guess you could say, politicians who are left of centre, as well as those who are on the Conservative side too. So, for example, in the UK, we have a CANZUK all-party parliamentary group that is attended by members of Parliament, from the Conservatives and also from Labour, and even the Scottish National Party as well, which was a surprise to us. We didn't think they'd have any interest in it, but they actually do, yeah. And of course, as well, you look at New Zealand right now. The New Zealand government is currently being run by Jacinda Ardern, who's from the Labour Party. And I think Winston Peters is obviously the deputy, and they're working in coalition together. So you could argue it's a left of centre government, but at the same time, they've also expressed interest in CANZUK, especially through the trade aspect of it. So whereas right now, they currently have a trade agreement with Australia called the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. They're interested in enhancing that to become the Closer Commonwealth Economic Relations Trade Agreement. So that would include Canada and the UK into that too. So you are right. It's a great observation that we have had majority support from, I guess you could say, politicians who are right of centre. That's anybody's guess as to why that's happened. Given my reasons why I think that is, and I could be right or wrong. But at the same time, we also do have support from across the board to whether it's Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats, Liberal, NDP, whatever it may be. So it's we like to think of it as we're a non-partisan organisation, also promoting a non-partisan idea that would benefit anybody and everybody, regardless of their party affiliation.
Yeah. Do you think it might also have something to do with your emphasis on the monarchy?
Potentially as well. I think that's another great point, is that obviously, I feel Conservatives obviously have a bit, more of an allegiance to the monarchy than, say, those of left-wing origin as well. So, obviously we view the monarchy is, sort of like a cornerstone of what was founded, and also a cornerstone of the foundations of all of this. And of course, Liberals, maybe those left of centre as well, wouldn't have that same affiliation. But of course, those who are Conservative would have an affiliation to that. So you're absolutely right. That could equally be a measure that's considered in terms of, Conservatives supporting this more than, say, the Liberals are.
Right. Some of your detractors have said that CANZUK is based upon ethnicity. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that?
I actually laugh when they say that, because just my personal observation on this is that I find those who are the biggest advocates of that train of thought are also the biggest advocates of the European Union. Right. So, when you consider the European Union is 27 majority Caucasian countries, all of whom, as far as I can tell, have majority Caucasian leaders, premiers and prime ministers and presidents as well. I find it ironic that they then criticize CANZUK, which is a union of 4 majority white countries, being racist. It doesn't make any sense to me. The reality is, as I've said before, is that CANZUK would work on so many levels, simply because of the similarities and the economic prosperity that these 4 countries have to offer their citizens and the world, I think, in terms of, security, intelligence, trade, and also the migration aspect too. The fact that they are majority Caucasian is simply a pure coincidence, in the same way that these countries are majority Christian. But, CANZUK is not declaring war on Sikhism or Islam or any other religion in the world. It's just a coincidence that they happen to be majority Christian in the same way that they are majority white as well. But, myself or my team, we've never focused on that. We've never advocated that to be a reason, and we've never thought that of being a reason either. If it was a reason, if we were trying to bring in majority white countries into a sort of union in this way, we would have brought in Cyprus and Malta into it as well. But notice we haven't done that either. So the arguments when people pose this to us just simply fall apart at the seams. So, I find it quite humorous, and I think, it's good to have arguments from all sides, and it's good to have debate on these topics as well. But at the same time, as long as people realize that that's not the case as to why we're advocating this, and it's actually for much better reasons, regarding prosperity, economic growth and opportunity and freedom for people to travel between these countries. I think that's the most important thing. And I think a vast majority of people see that as well.
Yeah. But say if Jamaica, or, of course, he observes the monarchy, you speak English as a first language,
Yeah.
Were to ask to join the CANZUK agreement, would you allow that?
It would strictly depend. I mean, right now we would advise no, because we've actually done extensive research into this, and we've compared it with a lot of other countries as well. So the top contenders, I guess you could call them, that we've been approached with are South Africa, India, the Bahamas, and Jamaica. So taking Jamaica, for example, as you've mentioned, or any country really, you do have to be very careful as to what countries you would admit to a sort of a union or an alliance, I guess you could say, like this. So for example, if we were to admit Jamaica to it, so it'd be a CANZUK J, or I don't know how you fit the J into the acronym somewhere there. But the reason it would be, I would advise against that, is simply because by admitting Jamaica into an alliance like this, you're not only causing harm to the CANZUK countries, but you're also causing harm to the Jamaican economy as well. So for example, the GDP per capita in the United Kingdom right now, I think is hovering around, the $48,000 mark. I think in New Zealand it's about 43. I think in Canada it's about, about 50, and I think in Australia it's about 53. So these countries are relatively comparative and similar in terms of their GDP per capita. Now you compare that with Jamaica, which I think the last time I checked only has about a GDP per capita of about $5,000 to $7,000. There's a wide divergence between the GDP per capita in Jamaica versus that of the CANZUK countries. So if you were to admit Jamaica, for example, into this alliance, what you would effectively see is that you would basically have Jamaicans saying, well, why would I stay in Jamaica where I can, be a doctor or a pharmacist or an architect or whatever profession they may have? Why would I stay here with, less, worse working conditions when I could simply move to a CANZUK country, not only have better working conditions, but I could have better social security, and I could also have a tenfold increase on my pay. So what you would actually have is you'd have the best and brightest of Jamaica actually creating a brain drain from Jamaica to come to the CANZUK countries in that sense. So realistically, it would actually do more harm to the economy of Jamaica to have them as part of this alliance that it would be to leave them out in the first place. Now, that's not to say, that Jamaica couldn't perhaps join in the future, providing it was decided upon democratically, not only by the people of the CANZUK countries, perhaps via a referendum or something, and also by the governments as well, mutually agreeing to it too. There's nothing to say that they couldn't do that in the future. It's a very similar process we would advocate for, and similar to what the European Union does right now, whereby if a country is going to annex onto the European Union, they do have to meet certain criteria with regards to human rights, with regards to economic growth, and also with regards to debt to GDP ratio. So providing Jamaica was able to improve its economic status and, improve its human rights records and other issues like this, and it was democratically decided by the people of CANZUK, by a referendum or by the governments or whatever it may be, then there's nothing to say Jamaica couldn't come on into the future. But for the time being, just for the, I guess you could say, the economic soundness of Jamaica right now, we wouldn't advise it. And we would do exactly the same with India and South Africa as well, because right now their economies are simply not compatible to join on to a CANZUK arrangement of that sort, if that makes sense.
Right. So Britain is leaving, slowly but surely, the European Union. And how has this affected CANZUK? It must have made it more of a real possibility, right?
It has. Brexit was actually a huge development for our campaign, simply because, with the UK as part of the European Union, the UK had its hands tied, really, with development of trade and migration policy. But what we've had now with I guess you could call it the independence vote in 2016, and also as well the official departure that we saw earlier this year, is that the UK now has tremendous opportunities to negotiate trade arrangements with other countries around the world. And we've been campaigning hard in the UK to say that, for about 48% of your country, it's a real shame that we've left the EU. For 52%, it's great, but for 100% of the country, we want CANZUK to be the next big thing for you guys, in terms of the freedom, the opportunity that you have to travel and live and work and study, the trade arrangements that will increase economic growth and prosperity, and also as well increase security through foreign policy cooperation through enhancing the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. So we've been campaigning really hard to make sure that in the UK, people understand that CANZUK is a viable alternative to EU membership. And also as well, that it's going to benefit everybody as well, not only the governments, but also the citizens of the UK too. So Brexit was instrumental in helping out our campaign for sure, and allowing us to be able to, reach the UK and say to them, here's a viable alternative for you now that we're leaving the European Union.
But a large part of the grievances that the British had with the EU was sort of the devolution of power and the lack of control. If you were to, say, join CANZUK and enact free movements of people, then surely it's sort of, jumping out of the hot water and into the sort of boiling pot, however the expression goes.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's one thing we have always said from the very get-go of our campaign is that we aim to be absolutely nothing like the European Union.
So it's not a project.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
It's not a political project.
No, absolutely not. No. So effectively what we are advocating for is that we would join onto the agreements already established between Australia and New Zealand, and that's both the trade and the migration agreements. The migration agreement being the Trans-Tasman Travel Agreement, and the trade arrangement being the Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. Mm-hmm. Both countries, you will notice, are sovereign, independent nations. They don't rely on a centralized currency. They don't rely on a centralized parliament. They don't have a central court system. They are sovereign, independent, and as far as I'm aware, they're always going to be as well. All we're simply advocating for is that Canada and the United Kingdom would join onto that arrangement. So instead of 2 independent sovereign nations, it would be 4 independent sovereign nations. So every country would keep its currency, every country would keep its parliament. There'd be, full autonomy with regards to decision-making and law-making between these 4 countries. There'd be no centralized court system, nothing of the sort. It would just simply be 4 independent countries. But what they would work towards is basically increased opportunity through migration, trade, and foreign policy cooperation, as what Australia and New Zealand are currently doing right now. So we've always said that from the get-go. We would be nothing like the European Union. There would be no centralization of power. And, citizens of the UK would not have to worry about, jumping from one sort of, I guess you could say centralized federalist union into another. It would be nothing of the sort.
Right. This is my last question. It's a real shame. We've totally burned through this interview. It's because I'm enjoying it so much.
Yeah, me too.
What would have to happen in order to make CANZUK a possibility? What are the next steps in each of these countries? And how real is it,
Yeah, well, to answer how real is it, I think it's obviously a very, very real prospect for sure. I mean, if somebody said to you in the 1950s, if we were alive in the 1950s, and someone said to you, hey, I've got this idea of, uniting 28 countries across the European Union, all of whom have, beaten the hell out of each other in a recent war. But I think we can make this work, and we can unite 28 countries, have a centralized court system and a currency. You would look at them as if they were crazy, but lo and behold, the European Union is, it's working today, and it's there before our very eyes. But, so to say that you could have, a union of 28 countries, all of whom speak different languages, have different cultures, have different court systems, have different ancestral backgrounds, and see that they can function, as a sort of a union in that sense. There's no reason why an alliance of 4 sovereign independent countries, all of whom share a majority language, the same, ancestral ties, the same parliamentary system, the same Westminster style system, common law legal system, very good GDP per capita rates, the same similarities as I've mentioned before. There's absolutely no reason why those 4 countries would not make it work either. To make it happen as well, I mean, it's a bit tricky because what we at CANZUK International essentially advocate for is not just change within one country, as I think 99% of all nonprofits do. We're advocating change within 4 countries, really, which makes it 4 times harder. So, of course, what you then have is 4 different governments, some of whom will be perhaps, left-leaning, some will be right-leaning, some will have different party agendas, some will put CANZUK at the top of the list, some will put CANZUK at the bottom of the list. So it can be very difficult to navigate those waters when there's such difference of opinion especially across these different time zones as well. But, you know, what we're effectively doing is we're working tirelessly to, you know, basically advocate for CANZUK across all governments to make sure that everybody understands that this is beneficial for everybody, regardless of what government you may be in, whether it's left wing, right wing, you know, southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere, it does not matter. So effectively what we will need is for these, you know, the governments of these countries to come together, whether it's through, you know, sort of convention, or whether it's through, you know, some sort of conference in the future, or just through regular government lobbying, to understand the benefits of this, come together, realize that this is beneficial, and it's also easily implemented as well, because we already have the templates put in place for trade and migration, you know, via what Australia and New Zealand are doing right now. And just for them to bring Canada and the UK into that and say, yeah, this is actually going to be a good idea. And, you know, it will take time. You know, it's not going to be something that's going to happen tomorrow or next week, but we're very confident that, in, you know, in the next couple of years or so, we can actually make this a reality. So, you know, we've got high hopes, and we're very confident that it's going to happen.
Wonderful. Well, James, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. It's been enormous fun.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, you know, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for having me on the show as well. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely.